2003. The time of the interview is 5:45 p.m. The interviewers today will be Joseph Demato, Joseph Gambino, and Danny Maccarone on camera. What is your full name?
My full name is George Michael Maccarone, Jr.
And where and when were you born?
I was born June 7th, 1945 in Glen, Cove, New York.
What was your pre-service education?
I graduated from Glen Cove High School in 1963 and entered Hamilton College in the fall of 1964. I transferred to C.W. Post and graduated from C.W. Post in June of 1968 with a BA in Finance and entered the service in August of 1968.
Okay. What was your pre-service occupation?
While I was going to college, I worked in the data processing department of a bank, which was then known as National Trust Company, and that's part of the fleet banking system.
What branch of service were you in?
I was in the United States Naval Reserve.
Why that branch?
Well, I guess I had a lifelong ambition to be in the Navy and hopefully to be in some form of naval aviation.
Where did you receive your basic training?
My basic training was received at Pensacola, Florida.
Do you have any experiences or feelings of that time?
It was tough. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the movie Officer and the Gentleman, but that's the program I went through back in the 60s when it was a pretty tough program. I remember a lot of sand, a lot of heat, and we did a lot of physical training, doing push-ups out in the parking lot, and I was picking asphalt fragments out of my palms for about another 6 months after I finished up. It was very rigorous training, but I really, looking back, I got a lot out of it.
It said here that you were Air Intelligence Photography Officer. Can you tell us what that was like and the experience with that and what you were a photographer of?
Yes, in an aviation squadron, most officers have what's called a ground billet and an aviation billet. My ground billet was Air Intelligence and Photography, and as such, I was responsible for briefing and debriefing crews before they went out on missions and after they came back from missions, and gathering information and interpreting it and passing it on to land-based intelligence units for interpretation. And as part of our intelligence gathering mission in the type of squadron that I belonged to, we had to do photography of surface ships.
What were the dates of your service?
I entered the service in August of 1968, and I was released from active duty in April of 1971.
How would you rate your training?
My training was absolutely in all phases.
What unit ship?
I was in an aviation squadron, and as it turned out, I had hoped to be a pilot when I enlisted. But when I took my initial physicals, it was determined that my left eye was 20/25, and as a result of that, I couldn't serve as a pilot, so I served as a flight officer. And I figured that since I couldn't fly the plane myself, I wanted to have as many engines as I could attached to the wings, and preferably not landing on carriers, so I chose land-based anti-submarine warfare. And we flew in a plane that was the equivalent of a Lockheed Electra airliner. It was 4 engines, turboprops, and never went on a carrier, which was just fine with me.
How would you rate your equipment?
We were particularly fortunate in having brand new equipment. The plane that I flew in when I went to my operational squadron was called the P-3C, which the Navy still operates. We were the second squadron to be equipped with the P-3C and the first squadron to go on an operational deployment with the P-3C. So in the sense that it was new equipment, it was state-of-the-art equipment. However, we did have quite a few problems with particularly the navigation and onboard camera systems until we got some of the problems ironed out.
Do you have any particular experiences or role in conflict that you could explain to us, maybe in chronological order?
By conflict, what do you mean?
Any basic coming into contact or battles that you experienced?
Well, although I served during the Vietnam War, I didn't serve in the Vietnam conflict per se. The Cold War was fought on many different fronts, if you will. You had your hot conflicts such as the Vietnam War, the Korean War, various and sundry brush fire wars over the course of the roughly 30 or 40 years that the Cold War, what's the word I'm looking for, that the Cold War encompassed. But we also fought, in the cold phase of the war, we fought on other fronts, fought in parentheses. The space race, the race to get a man on the moon, the technology race, and the area in which I fought, if you will, in submarine and anti-submarine technology. We were a VP-49, the outfit in which I served was a land-based anti-submarine squadron, and our mission was to patrol the oceans and basically keep an eye on the bad guys, to find out where they were and as much as possible what they were up to, and also to gather intelligence by photographing the ships and gathering acoustic information on them.
Did you receive any medals or citations?
Yes, our squadron, I didn't receive any individual commendations. However, our squadron received a Presidential Unit Citation for a mission that we undertook while we were deployed up in Keflavick, Iceland during the period of July 1970 through October 1970. We went on a very highly classified mission. Several planes of our squadron, my crew was not involved in it directly, but we sent a couple of planes on a few covert missions far north of the Arctic Circle because the Russians were testing one of their brand new submarines out there, and we wanted to go out there and pick up acoustic information on it to find out something about what it was all about.
How did you keep in touch with those at home?
By letters, and also we were able to make phone calls, so I was pretty much in contact with the folks at home at all times.
Do you have any experience about how the food was like or the supplies?
I really have no complaints about the food. We weren't in a combat unit, and we were stationed on a military base most of the time. I wasn't on a ship. So I guess the food was pretty decent.
What was your most memorable experience?
Well, I guess the things that happened during the deployment up in Iceland. One of the things was the scenario I just mentioned to you, where we sent a few planes out to hunt down a new type of Russian submarine. Another experience was that one of our planes went out about a week after we got up there. One of our planes went out and had apparently gotten some very good intelligence information from the Norwegians concerning a new Russian submarine that was just going out on its initial cruise. It had just come out of production, and it was on its what's called a shakedown cruise. And it had come around the North Cape of Norway and was transiting down in the gap between Iceland and Europe. And the Norwegians typically would pick up the submarines first and then hand them over to us. And my crew was on 24-hour standby. We had to be ready to launch about 15 minutes notice if called upon. And another crew had gone out on station, and they got, apparently, it was either due to great intelligence information or sheer dumb luck, I don't know which to this day, but they dropped a passive whistling buoy into the water, and they practically hit this guy right in the conning tower. And within 10 minutes they had run an active pattern on this particular sub, and they had it pinned down. Had it been a wartime situation, it would have been a big win for our side. They would have had this guy dead to rights. And our crew was launched to go out and relieve the crew that was on station. And I guess what happened was the Russian sub got in touch with his people back in the USSR, and they got in touch with the politicians. Their politicians got in touch with our politicians, and they called us off midway there and sent us someplace else. We got called off that contact. But we had spooked the Russians so badly, they apparently wanted to find out what the heck it was that we had. We bounced this guy so quickly, so they mounted a very typically Russian type of intelligence operation against us. During the course of our deployment, there was an earthquake in Peru, and the Russians came out on this big public relations offensive. This was one of the first times they ever did this, and they said, oh, we're going to send, you know, hundreds and hundreds of plane loads of supplies down to Peru. But there's only one problem. Our planes can't fly all the way from Russia to Peru. So we're going to need to land at the international air base at Keflavick to refuel. Can we do that? So the Icelanders said, sure, you know, it's a humanitarian thing after all. So they said, yeah, you can land there for 30 days. So all of a sudden, one day I woke up and I was walking down to our squadron hangar, and there were these two huge Russian transports parked out in front of the hangar. And I found out why they were there. And this went on for a period of, I'd say about 2 weeks. The transport would come and they'd go, come and go, come and go. And suddenly one day, two of these huge things landed and took off, and a couple of hours later, one of them radioed a mayday, that he was ditching off Greenland. So now they launched the Air Force Search and Rescue Squadron from Keflavick, and we sent a few planes out to look for these guys, and we never found a trace of this airplane. Typically, when a plane goes down at sea, there's going to be some kind of debris that indicates the approximate location of where this thing went down. Now, this plane disappeared without a trace, which indicates that what they actually did was they took off, they got up so people could see them on the radar, then they ducked down very low, and they flew under the radar all the way down to Cuba, because the particular plane involved had very, very long-range capabilities, which we knew. So we knew the Russians were, you know, kind of sandbagging, but we didn't know why. So now the Russians said, oh, gee whiz, we have a lost airplane out there, so we have to send our own search planes in to look for our airplane. So the Icelanders, of course, being great humanitarians and not being able to say, sure, okay, you have another 30 days. So the Russians brought in a couple of airplanes that were so bogged down with antennas they looked like flying porcupines. And these guys would come in, and they had the planes parked over near the end of the runway, and they were living in like an old boiler house. They didn't stay in the same quarters that we did. But we talked with each other back and forth. I mean, it was kind of, we were enemies, but not really enemies. We were kind of friendly enemies at that point. But they would come out, and they'd look up at the sky and say, gee whiz, too cloudy, we can't fly today. And they'd go and sit there in the airplanes all day, and what they were actually doing was they were monitoring all of our communications, and recording everything to kind of see what it was that we had in this brand new airplane. So that was, it was an ongoing thing that went on probably a good half of the time we were up on deployment up in Iceland, and it was kind of a fascinating microcosm of what the Cold War was all about.
In your record, you mentioned that you had significant problems with your inertial navigation systems and aerial photography. Can you explain that?
Yeah, the Navy tried something new when they bought this system. They basically decided that we were going to take it out in the field and kind of work all the bugs out of it. And the inertial navigation system works with 3 little gyros that sense pitch, roll, and yaw. And they had a system in the older P-3 aircraft that had been proven to be quite reliable. And it was manufactured by Bendix. The one that they put into the P-3C was manufactured by Singer, the sewing machine company. That was the first foray into airborne navigation systems. And at the time that the P-3C was being built, Boeing was also building the first 747s. They put a similar inertial navigation system into the 747s, but because it wasn't built to military specifications, it didn't have the same accuracy that was demanded by the military. However, because it didn't have to be quite as sensitive, it was more reliable. So we had, our system would dump it, when the plane took off, and just from the shock of the wheels being retracted into the wheel wells, that was enough to cause the system to dump quite often. And this could be a real problem when you're out there, trying to find out where you are. And it took the better part of a year before we finally got the bugs ironed out in the navigation system. It was critical to the performance of our mission, because when you found a submarine out there, you had to know exactly where it was, because not for that airplane per se, but let's say if we were prosecuting a contact over a long period of time, several hours, and you had another plane coming out on station, you had to be able to transmit accurate information to the relieving plane so he would know exactly where to go to pick up your contact and not lose the submarine. And that was very vital to what we needed to do. In keeping tabs on what the Russians were doing out there, we were actually defending our homeland, because in those days the Russians had the largest submarine fleet in the world, far greater in numbers than what we had. And they, at any given time, would have submarines off all of our major ports on the east and west coasts, practically within viewing distance. If they had surfaced, we would have been able to see them, say, from Jones Beach. They were right outside the 12-mile limit, and they were augmented by a surface force of boats disguised as fishing trawlers, which were actually electronic intelligence gathering ships, which were trying to, they were keeping tabs on what we were doing and radioing the information down to the submarines. So what we were trying to do in the overall sense was sort of preserve a stalemate between us and the bad guys down there underwater, keep them pinned down, and if, God forbid, the Cold War ever turned hot, we had to know where they were so we could get them before they could launch ballistic missiles and threaten the continental United States. It's a very important mission.
You spoke about the sub being just 12 miles out off of Jones Beach. Were the civilians ever notified about this at all?
Yeah, there was quite a bit of information that could be found in the mainstream media about the submarine, the submarine / anti-submarine phase of the Cold War. In fact, I probably learned most of what I learned about the OSIS system by reading an article in Time magazine. SOSUS is an acronym for Sound Underwater Surveillance System. If any of you guys have studied oceanography, you know that sound can travel hundreds or thousands of miles under the water. And SOSUS was a system that was set up in the early and mid-60s, consisting of microphones placed in various places on the ocean bottom in the major shipping lanes all around the world, and the information would feed into certain gathering points, and they could, based on where the microphones were placed in the various thermal layers of the water, you could pick up sounds of submarines. Let's say you might have a SOSUS array somewhere off Norfolk, and if it was placed in just the right place, you could pick up sounds of a submarine coming around the North Cape of Norway. And this was a result of decades of underwater research.
You had stated that they developed a new flight procedure to obtain intelligence. Can you explain that?
Yeah, in the older planes, in the P-3As and Bs, they had a different type of an onboard camera system. With the new plane, we had a camera built by a company called Topcon. And it had a different type of a look-down angle, a wider aperture field of view. So when we went out and we tried to fly the same pattern that we flew with the P-3As and Bs, we were not able to get the proper type of photography to analyze what we would see on a ship. So I had to devise a new plan, a new pattern for planes to fly to take advantage of the physics of the new camera system. You had to consider the physical characteristics of the camera as well as international conventions and treaties regarding where adversary planes, how close they could approach and at what altitude. So we have to factor both of these things into consideration when designing the pattern that we would fly around surface ships in order to get proper photographs. What you're looking for in an intelligence photograph of a surface ship is you're going to say, let's say we're considering this ship on the table here, this ship model. We're going to fly down one side, fly around the back, fly up the starboard side, and fly around the front. Then make a pass overhead at a certain altitude. And your automatic camera system is firing at a rate of 4 frames a second. And what have you guys ever looked at a Viewmaster? So you put the little Viewmaster reel in the viewer, and you're looking at, it's called stereo photography. And you've got 2 flat pictures, but it brings everything out in 3D. And this is what we were doing with the airborne camera systems on the P-3C. You could take a look at 2 flat photographs of this ship, and everything would sort of pop up in 3D. So an intelligence analyst could look at what that ship was carrying on its decks and figure out what the weapon systems were. By looking at the antenna arrays on the ship, you could figure out what its offensive and defensive radar capabilities were and so forth.
Can you describe your relationship with the Allied military forces?
We had an extremely good working relationship with the Norwegians. The Norwegians were and are probably the best anti-submarine forces in the world because they existed in close proximity with the Russians, and they would fly their P-3s. They didn't have the same, they had a less advanced model of P-3 than we did, but they would fly their P-3s up around the North Cape, and they actually photographed the Russian submarines in the shipbuilding ways in Murmansk Harbor. And apparently they told the Russians through diplomatic channels, if you ever shoot down one of our airplanes, not one of your submarines will ever make it around the Cape. We'll sink every one of them. So the Russians gave them an awful lot of leeway. And unlike our military service, the Norwegians would put a crew together and leave these guys together for their entire careers. So the crew became like a veteran sports team, and they worked together and they achieved a very high degree of expertise. We made up for a lot of difference by having very good technology. There's our ship just sailing at this site now. We're backing up full speed astern.
Can you describe your relationship with within your unit?
We had a particularly good unit because, in view of the fact that we were one of the first units to get the P-3C aircraft, and we were the first unit to be selected to deploy overseas, the Navy had elected to put quite a few elite, they culled the best people that they had in anti-submarine warfare and put them into our squadron. We had a particularly good squadron with very, very good group cohesion, very high group morale, and the crews were, our crew, for instance, we were a bunch of guys who were very, very fond of each other, enlisted men and officers alike. We had very good, very high crew morale.
Can you describe any relationship with government officials?
Based based on the difficulties we had with some of our equipment and our unhappiness with the government procurement procedure, I am going to take a pass on that question.
Okay.
Let me just say this, let me elaborate. I will backtrack a little bit. In terms of the cameras themselves, the airborne cameras that we had, that was my particular bailiwick, being the photographic officer. And we had no end of trouble with these darn things. We ended up having to go to a handheld Polaroid camera and try and shoot out the side window of the airplane, which is really not a very viable alternative. We had these darn cameras up there, which the Navy had paid $800 for. This is back in 1965. And you try to shoot these pictures with a handheld Polaroid camera through polarized glass in the cockpit window, and it just didn't work. Because the cameras, when the government buys something, they say, okay, each individual item is going to have what's called a mean time between failures of a certain number of cycles. So they had all these little switches that governed the speed of the film through the camera and the shutter speed and all this stuff. And the government specs call for, it has to go 30,000 cycles before an average one is going to fail. Well, it turned out that the switches on these cameras were failing almost uniformly after fewer than 300 cycles, which rendered the cameras virtually useless. And trying to get support from the company to fix these darn things was like, trying to pull teeth from a chicken. For virtually the entire time I was in the squadron, we were not able to get those cameras functioning properly. And that, as I previously said, was a very, very big part of our mission. And we couldn't fulfill it.
In what area did you serve, and did terrain and climate affect the battle?
My squadron was home ported in Patuxent River, Maryland, which is right down the Potomac from Washington, and we deployed to Keflavick, Iceland in 1970, as I've already mentioned. And terrain and climate did have a significant influence on what we were able to do, particularly up in Iceland, because you have bad weather quite a good part of the time, and it has an adverse effect on your operations.
What was your reaction to military leadership, and why?
That's a really good question, because today we're, with what you guys are seeing with the reaction to the war in Iraq, we're now sort of questioning the premise under which our troops were sent to Iraq, because the alleged weapons of mass destruction have not materialized. So people are saying, well, gee whiz, that's how they sold us on this. This is very analogous to something you may have studied in history at the outset of the Vietnam conflict, which was called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. There was an alleged attack on a couple of U.S. Navy destroyers by Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin, and it turned out that those situations were kind of distorted as a means of selling the American public on the need to increase our presence in Vietnam. Our military leadership, when I was in the service, I think their hearts were in the right place, but their heads may not have been. The war was quite micromanaged. I lost a few very good friends over there. So you really have to question why we were there. The objectives were very unclear. I don't know whether that was so much a question of the military leadership or the civilian leadership at the time. But you look back and say, what did we accomplish? In the overall sense, it may have served a purpose when you consider that in combination with the Korean conflict and the other brush fire wars in which we engaged, and that we did tell the Russian Empire that we were not going to let them take over the world. To this day, I still think there was a very real threat there. And as the gentleman who was here a few weeks ago spoke about the Korean conflict, said, in retrospect, the Korean War was very important because we drew the line against the Russians. And I think we did somewhat the same thing in Vietnam. So maybe in the long run, it did serve a purpose. And at the time, as we were seeing, body counts increase and not that much to show for it, I think we had our doubts.
What did you do when you arrived home?
Well, what had happened was, I was supposed to serve about 4.5 years. But when I went in, even though it was in 1968 and the war was going pretty hot and heavy over in Vietnam, they were already looking at the end of the tunnel in terms of building down. So the number of guys they were taking into aviation was starting to decrease already, even though we didn't really disengage from Vietnam fully for another 4 or 5 years. They were already planning for that down the road. When I went in as a reservist on active duty, my term of service was supposed to be about 4.5 years. But at the end of 1970, the Navy decided to cut back on anti-submarine and basically the fleet in general. So I actually only served a total of about a little bit less than 3 years on active duty. So I got out a little bit unexpectedly. So I figured, let me go out and do something I hadn't done since I was about 11 years old, which was take a summer off. I'd been selling newspapers and working in a record store and working in the bank while I was going to college, so I took the entire summer off after I got out and I played some golf.
What occupations after that summer did you have?
I went to work as a medical equipment salesman, which what I did for about 17 or 18 years. And then I went with my first love, which was the railroad. I became a locomotive engineer, which I'm still doing on the LIRR. I've been there for the last 16 years.
Do you belong to any veterans organizations?
At this time, no.
Have you ever?
I had considered joining the American Legion. As a non-combat veteran, I'm not eligible to be a member of the Veterans of Foreign Wars. And again, as a non-combat veteran and a non-theater veteran, I'm not eligible to be a member of the Vietnam Veterans of America. So I have been approached about joining the American Legion.
Have you attended any reunions?
No, but thanks to the internet, in the last couple of months, I have established contact with a couple of guys who were on my crew back in VP-49, with whom I haven't spoken in over 30 years. And I received a call about 6 weeks ago from the guy who was my flight engineer, and it was just really a thrill to get in touch with him. And I mentioned the fellow in my questionnaire, Chief Glen, he was not on my crew, but he was in my squadron. And I've been in contact with him via the internet, and we are hoping within the next year or so to have a little get-together of as many of the guys from our squadron as we can cobble up. And I look forward to that with great expectation.
How did your experience change or influence your life?
I would go through it again in a heartbeat. I think it was a marvelous experience, going through all the basic training, getting yelled at and screamed at by the Marine drill instructors. I think it's something everybody ought to have a chance to do. You guys get a little bit of a taste of it here at Chaminade, which is, discipline and being taught that the team sometimes is more important than the individual, and that you do things for you do things for the people in your unit, or your classmates or whatever. And that's a very, very valuable thing to be taught. In this society today, there's too much individualism and, the feel about what's in it for me. And I was taught in the service that the team comes first, and I think that's a very, very, very important thing to understand. We have a lot of privileges and rights as members of this wonderful country that we belong to, but we also have responsibilities. And that's one thing that a lot of kids aren't being taught today. You guys are very, very fortunate in that as students at Chaminade, you're taught that lesson every day. And that's one of the things I learned in the service. I'd do it again in a heartbeat.
Did you maintain contact with any personal friends while you were in the service, besides your family?
Yes, I did. I kept contact with a couple of my former classmates, a couple of buddies that went into the service and were over in Vietnam.
Were any of these previous friends, did any of them go into the same area that you did?
No. No, I went down there pretty much by myself. I didn't know anybody in my basic training outfit or all the way through into my squadron.
Was your American involvement justified, do you believe?
Absolutely, yes. What we did was something I fully believed in. I was defending my home. I was defending New York. I was defending the soil of my country. Absolutely.
What exactly would you photograph on a ship in front of you, and why?
Could you please repeat the question?
What exactly?
What would I photograph?
Yeah.
We would fly, as I said before, we would fly at a certain altitude to take advantage of the look-down capability of the camera. We would fly down the side. What we're looking for, if I can pick this up, you're looking for, let's say, here you would have a gun director radar, and you're looking to see what's up on these masts, because you can tell from the configuration of the antenna what that antenna does, what kind of a signal it sends out, or what kind of a signal it receives, what kind of fighter director radar it's got, the type of armament the ship's got, what it may or may not be carrying on the deck, the length of the ship, the width of the ship, the speed of the ship, and so forth. One thing I should mention about the submarines that we encountered out there in the Atlantic. The Russian submarines were assigned code names based on phonetic pronunciations of the alphabet in military terms. And the submarine that we encountered most often was called the Yankee class, or the Y class, Soviet ballistic missile sub. It was their first, or their equivalent of our Polaris type submarines, in that they were almost copies of the Polaris subs, with one odd exception. Around that time, we got the Polaris missile subs in the water before, several years before the Russians did. And there was a model company that was right down the road here on Glen Cove Road in Carl Place, called Renwall. Fred Lawrence may remember that, I don't know, but they were a very popular model builder when I was a kid. And they built a model of a Polaris missile submarine based on what they thought it would look like, because all that information was classified. So it had a cutaway, and you could see all the various compartments in there and everything. And lo and behold, when the Russian Yankee class submarine came out, they had gone and bought it. They went to a toy store and they bought a model a Renoir model of a Yankee submarine, and that's what their submarine looked like, right down to the incorrectly built propeller, and that was one of the ways that we had to keep track of the submarines until relatively recently. The Russians were not able to build submarines that would travel underwater nearly as quietly as American submarines. Our friends from Toshiba, one of the Japanese electronics companies, through several intermediaries, sold the Russians a milling machine with computer software to enable them to make propellers that ran virtually as quietly as those on American submarines, and gave the Russians a big leg up in submarine technology. Thank goodness the Soviet Union collapsed and has not been able to maintain a great blue water navy like they had back in the 70s and early 80s, because those new propellers, coupled with some advances that they have made in hull design and propulsion machinery, would enable them to be very, very, very formidable adversaries in undersea warfare. And having been, an anti-submarine sailor myself, I'm very happy that the Soviet Empire has collapsed, and we no longer really have to fear them as a underwater adversary. I do see the Chinese becoming a really powerful adversary within the next 20 years, though. And it's unfortunate that we have really allowed our anti-submarine assets to diminish significantly because of the perceived lack of a threat right now. But we really need to be keeping our defenses up, because we're going to need it again someday. My squadron was deactivated in 1994. We went on vacation to Hawaii a couple of years ago, and it was a very important anti-submarine base just west of Honolulu Airport called Barbers Point. And I was shocked to fly over there and find out that the base has been totally abandoned. And I think really that's a big mistake. Another interesting thing that I just thought of is that you may recall that 2 years ago, right at the beginning of Bush's term, there was an incident involving an American reconnaissance plane that was forced down onto Hainan Island. Interestingly enough, that plane was originally part of my squadron. When BP-49 was deactivated in 1994, the planes were taken back by the Navy and they were reconfigured from anti-submarine aircraft to electronic reconnaissance planes. And that particular plane was one of the ones in my squadron. I've actually flown in that plane.
In your record, you mentioned your mission gave you advantage to defend your homeland, as opposed to fighting in a war in which your goals were never defined. Can you explain why your goals were never defined?
It wasn't my goals, as an individual. It was our goals as a nation. The goal was to stop communist aggression. Okay, we stopped that. And now what do you do? Yeah, and we're facing somewhat a similar dilemma now in Iraq. We won the war. We won the shooting war. Now how do we win the peace? And that's the thing we were facing over in Vietnam. And you have to confront the possibility that, these people may not really want to adopt your way of life. And they may not really want you over there. We got rid of, the noose around their necks, and now they, maybe they don't want us there anymore. So how do we win the peace? And that was what we were facing in Vietnam also. The objectives were much less clear than I think they've been framed in the current conflict. The Vietnamese did not mount an attack against this country as the Islamic terrorists have done. So that has given us a rallying cry, what would be called in diplomatic parlance a casus belli, to a certain extent, much more so than what we had in Vietnam.
Thank you very much, Mr. Maccarone, for sharing your information and various experiences during the Cold War.
Well, it's been a pleasure and an honor to be here, and thanks very much for having me.
Thank you.